This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan Podcast, where this year we're exploring the weekly Haftorah portion. This week's episode has been sponsored in memory of Selwyn Feinblum, Shabtai Gedalia ben Yosef Tzvi, whose shloshi was this past week. The episode is dedicated in honor of his love for laning, Torah, and learning. For those of you who listen weekly, sponsoring an episode can be a great way to honor a memory, a friend, and even mark a momentous occasion. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. Parshat Vayetzei opens with Yaakov running from Esav and from the home of his youth. After arriving in Haran, he goes to sleep and has the famous ladder dream, which awakens him to the presence of God in the area he later names Beit El. God promises him progeny and a bright future. Yaakov builds an altar and vows to return. After this, Yaakov comes upon a well covered by a large stone that must be removed to retrieve its water. Miraculously, Rachel shows up at the same well, and Yaakov, in a moment of inspiration, is able to move the stone and provide her sheep with water. They meet, fall in love, and marry. Well, not quite. As we know, the story that ensues is somewhat more complex because of social norms, because of a less than transparent father-in-law, and because Yaakov's family life is constantly intertwined with struggle. The Parsha continues with the birth of the tribes, a monumental historical development that takes place against the backdrop of strained family dynamics between Leah and Rachel and between Yaakov and his wives. The rest of the Parsha follows the development of Yaakov's family in the house of Lavan. The dealings with the shared flocks again puts Yaakov in this position of being the trickster, perhaps unintentionally, likely unintentionally. The same atmosphere shrouds over Rachel's stealing of her father's idols. The family of Yaakov causes distress in the house of Lavan to the point that they must leave. Movingly, the Parsha ends with reconciliation. Lavan catches up with Yaakov, guided by a divine message to speak kindly, and puts things on the table with Yaakov. It is a moment of familial communication, of desire to end things well, still sorely missing in Yaakov and Esav's relationship. Beautifully, Yaakov's meeting Rachel begins with the removal of a stone from a well, and the Parsha ends here with the erection of a monument symbolizing Yaakov and Lavan's alliance. While Yaakov has many more miles to travel, this moment may be the beginning of a more direct form of dialogue that will serve us in small ways in the coming Prakim. This week's Haftorah portion is from the book of Hoshea, but the selection has variance between different communities. Ashkenazi communities read Hoshea 12:13 right through the end of the book, and Sephardic communities read from 11:7 to 12:12. We've decided this week to speak about the broad swath of these chapters, and in that way sort of be able to offer something to different communities as well. Hoshea is listed as one of the first prophets in the book of Trei Asar, which we introduced last week when we spoke about the book of Malachi. But the book of Hoshea is the longest book alongside with Zechariah, which are 14 chapters long. Hoshea was an 8th century BCE prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel who was active during the final decades before Israel's fall to Assyria. He served as a passionate voice, calling the people back to covenantal faithfulness amid their widespread idolatry, political turmoil, and social injustice. Hoshea is especially known for his symbolic marriage to Gomer, which illustrated God's steadfast love towards a spiritually unfaithful nation. Through vivid imagery, poetic oracles, and heartfelt warnings, Hoshea proclaims both divine judgment and God's enduring desire to restore his people. So when I was thinking about who in this world loves the book of Hoshea, I immediately thought of Professor Sam Lebens. Hi, Sam.
Hello.
Dr. Samuel Lebens is an associate professor in the philosophy department at the University of Haifa. He's also an Orthodox rabbi and Jewish educator. He has written books on the nature of propositions, the philosophy of fiction, and the foundational principles of Jewish faith. Among them, Bertrand Russell and the Nature of Propositions, The Principles of Judaism, Thinking About Stories, an Introduction to Philosophy of Fiction, his, I guess we would call his lay book, A Guide to the Jewish Undecided, and has a forthcoming book called God's Chosen People. So, Sam, I immediately thought of you because Hoshea is a really complicated book. For me, it's up there. It's up there with Yeshayahu, to be quite honest, of a book that, while some of its central themes are rather clear, which is an unfaithfulness of the people, God's love of Am Yisrael. We'll talk about maybe on the heels of repentance or maybe something else. The themes are clear, but the language is very difficult and challenging. And there's also a lot of repetition in the book once you pass the first 3 chapters that are that sort of divine metaphor or prophetic act, or however we define his marriage to Gomer. But you've written really movingly in different places I've seen about the theology that's reflected through the book of Hoshea. And that's what we wanted to focus on in our conversation today. So jump in there wherever it feels right, whether you want to talk a little bit about who is Hoshea and what about him may move you, or we could talk straight about sort of the theology that's reflected, particularly, of course, in the Parkim of this week's Haftorah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can't. I don't think you can relate to the later prakim of Hoshea without thinking about that kind of guiding metaphor of the first few prakim with this marriage to Gomer. So for our listeners who are less acquainted with the book of Hoshea, and I don't necessarily blame them for being less acquainted with it. It's tucked away in Trei Asar after all. As far as we're aware, the first time that Hoshea experiences God speaking to him is with this. I can't think of an appropriate adjective to describe it because it's crazy. He receives this kind of crazy command, audacious, but much more than audacious. It's ridiculous. He receives this command to marry a prostitute, and you're like, what? That's the first thing you tell me, God. I've got so many questions for you, God, and yet this is the thing you want me to do. And later on in the 3rd perek, he's commanded to marry this woman who has a history of adultery, and who her paramours, the people that she had been unfaithful with, are still on the scene. God says, I want you to, and not just to marry, but to love, to fall in, as if you can be commanded to fall in love. And it's not clear, by the way, whether the woman in the prostitute in the first chapter is the same as the woman in the 3rd chapter. Yeah. There are different accounts of this. The Radak was so scandalized by the whole thought of this that he said, clearly God didn't really ask a prophet to do that. The whole thing is an allegory. But other commentators have taken it more literally, that this is really what God required Hoshea to do. And I think in his book on the prophets, Rabbi Abraham Yehoshua Heschel really unpacks very vividly what I think the most straightforward reading of this whole framing metaphor of the book of Hoshea is, which is that if Hoshea is going to be able to be a spokesperson for God, then he needs to understand, kivyachol, so to speak, what it is that God is going through, because God has fallen in love with a people who continuously spur his affection and chase after other gods who are like these paramours, who are habitually unfaithful to him. And the way that Rav Heschel takes this is relatively literally, because he has this theology of divine pathos, according to which God actually has an emotional life, and that the job of the prophet isn't merely to convey the propositional content, the kind of the sentences, the words that God communicates to the prophet. The prophet doesn't merely have to convey that content. He also has to experience, so to speak, God's pathos, what it is that God is feeling. There's a very harsh a response to Heschel from Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz. It was published in Tradition in the 60s, saying, how can you say this? God doesn't, God is transcendent, doesn't have these feelings. Whenever the rabbis spoke as if God had an emotional life, it was always couched with language like kivyachol, which is this rabbinic phrase that kind of means like, were it possible to say, then we would say, but it's not possible to say. Interestingly, and this is a fascinating episode in American Orthodox history, is that the editorial board of Tradition were very uncomfortable with Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz's critique of Heschel, and actually published a disclaimer at the beginning of Rabbi Berkovitz's critique, saying, we're publishing Rabbi Berkovitz's critique of Heschel, but on the substance of the issue, we're on Heschel's side, which is, really bizarre.
Yeah, you would totally think the opposite, because you would think that they would take the more traditional position.
Exactly.
For the record, Heschel's position on this is biblical pshat. And the question is, are you supposed to take it as pshat? Meaning, God talks about his emotions all the time, right? He's angry and he's forgiving, and in this case, we'll focus on his love, but it's everywhere. And so you have to do a lot of the mental leaps of saying it's kivyachol, and Chazal do that, but it's not at all the thrust, and it's not how Moshe responds to him. Everybody takes his emotions very seriously.
That's right. And interestingly, I suppose one of the reasons perhaps you invited me to discuss this Haftorah with you is that one of the things I've written about a lot is whether the philosophical objections that don't really emerge until medieval times, strong philosophical objections emerge against the thought that God could really have an emotional life. Medieval theology doesn't countenance that, because God transcends all description and certainly transcends what were thought in medieval times to be the kind of pollutants or intoxicants of emotion, because emotion clouds judgment, and emotions are just a consequence of having a body. And since God doesn't have a body, God isn't clouded with emotion. But as you say, until medieval times, Chazal speak as if God has an emotional life. Yes, they couch it with this kivyachol language, but the pshat of the Bible, right from the beginning to the end, is God. God is an emotional being, and it's one of the things that I've dealt with in kind of my philosophical theology is whether it's really so heretical or counter philosophical, let's say, to believe in a God who does have an emotional life. And a second reason I think the thing that you've read where I deal with Hoshea is one of the things that fascinates me about the metaphor, even if you take it just as a metaphor, that Israel is like this lover, this problematic woman that Hoshea is told to wed and fall in love with. The question is, what exact experience is Hoshea supposed to go through? Is it that he's supposed to fall in love with a woman who he just admires and then go through the experience of being cheated on and kind of suspecting her of adultery, etc., or is he supposed to fall in love with a woman who he knows from the outset is prone to infidelity? And it seems like the second option is actually the pshat, right? So that sheds an interesting light back on God's relationship with Am Yisrael. It suggests that God knew what he was getting into when he chose the Israelites, and yet he loved them. So that's the context in which our concluding chapters of this book occur. I find these chapters particularly difficult because it keeps turning on a dime. God goes from being very loving to very angry, and then back again. It's like a very unstable lover is the way he comes across. I think one of the reasons at least some communities start the Haftorah where they start it, Hoshea 12, verse 13, is that it begins with Yaakov fleeing back to Eretz Yisrael. And Yaakov did this all alone. And he must have been terrified, and he must have been, all sorts of. We know what happens. He ends up fighting with this angel. It is a terrifying journey, but he did it all alone. And this is compared with the journey of Am Yisrael out of Egypt, which wasn't alone at all. We had, God was right there with us, and the prophet was there, and it was all vivid, and there was no room for doubt or really for fear because we were so well protected. And yet, we end up sinning.
And I think also in many places where Hoshea quotes sort of stories that we know, if I'll just read the psukim that you just referred to, the beginning of the Haftorah, as we said for Ashkenazim, Vayivrach Yaakov sde aram, Vayavod Yisrael v'isha v'isha shamar, right? That Yaakov had to flee to the land of Aram, and there Israel served for a wife, meaning, i.e., we're speaking here essentially about his meeting with his wives. But then it says, Uvenavi ha'ela Adonai et Yisrael v'mitzrayim, Uvenavi nishmar. Okay, that when Hashem brought Israel out from Egypt, it was through a prophet, and through a prophet they were guarded, right? And you're saying that it's comparing these two scenarios, but they're not particularly similar.
Yeah, what I take it to mean, I may be wrong, but literally what I take it to mean, I'd be interested to hear if you think this is onto something, but is that, look, Yaakov did all of that all alone. Whereas with you guys, it was with a Navi. Right. So, you don't have the sorts of excuses that Yaakov, could have relied upon, but didn't rely upon, right? Because Yaakov was faithful.
I think also we have again, if we go back to the love idea, like Yaakov's life is sort of like suffused in this element of love, meaning there's the love of his mother, which pushes him to then do something that obviously is very, very difficult. And then he's going to have the love of Rachel, which is also going to sometimes blind, right? Meaning there's something about like almost like the danger, meaning on one hand, the love feeds the journey, but it also can be blinding, which of course we know just from life.
Yeah. But Yaakov, I think at least in this couplet of verses, yes, Yaakov is presented as a faithful lover, and Israel, who had, everything served to them on a silver platter, so to speak, haven't lived up to the faithfulness of Jacob as a lover of God. So the next thing I would like to focus on, unless there's something else that piques your eye beforehand, I'll tell you why I find this so disturbing. But verse 7 in chapter 13, it talks about how the build up to this verse is about how Israel and Ephraim in particular, i.e. the northern kingdom that Hoshea is prophesying to, have become haughty, have served other gods, have forgotten about God, and have spurred God's love. And then it says this, Va'ehi lahem kamo shachal, right? I am to them, or I will be to them like a lion, kenamer al derech Ashur, like a leopard on the way to Ashur. Ef geshem, which means I will encounter them, right? Kedov shakul, as if I were a bereaved bear. Ve'ekras gor libam, I will tear apart their torso, the sagor libam, the thing that holds their hearts, the cage of their hearts, right? I will tear apart the cage of their hearts. Ve'ochlem sham kalavi, and I will eat them there like a lion. Chayat hasadeh tvakeem, and wild beasts, like when I'm done, when I've had my fill, wild beasts of the field will continue to devour them. Sometimes in biblical theology, the curses that occur to the Jewish people are merely the consequence of Hester Panim, of God hiding his face, of God turning, so God, okay, you spur me, I'll spur you. And let's see what happens when you've got no divine protection. The beasts of the field come and eat you. But the more disturbing passages in biblical theology are where God is active in inflicting pain upon the Jewish people. One of the reasons I find this so disturbing is when you put it in the context of the framing metaphor of the book of Hoshea, which is a marriage. It screams domestic violence, right? And that is shocking, and one doesn't know what to do with that. Okay.
I think also this question of whose perspective are we speaking from? Meaning, in this case, God is the speaker, right? He's speaking about his own perspective, which is why it's disturbing, because if it was the voice of a prophet or the voice of another figure, you could say, oh, well, that was their experience of God. But in this case, I think that I'm just sort of adding insult to injury. We have here God being the feeder of both of these elements. And then it goes back to this question of, well, are we looking for the divine love, or are we looking for some sort of divine vengeance? Because this fits more, it seems like, in a metaphor of vengeance.
Yeah, except I think your question is so apposite, because you ask, okay, whose perspective is this? And you're right, at some level of analysis, it seems like, well, this is God's perspective. But the first two words of the excerpt I'm reading, Vayehi lahem ke, right? I shall be to them like. So lahem is to them, right? Mm-hmm. And the ke is important too, like, or kamo, right? So there's already a little bit of an escape hatch from the worst possible reading, which is, I'm just going to rip them apart. I hate them. Rather, he's saying they're going to experience me as if that's what I am. Mm-hmm. Right? Not necessarily that this is actually what I'm going to do. Ef geshem, I'm going to have an encounter with them. Kedov, where I will appear like a bear, right? But will I really be the bear? And then I compare this to later parts of the Haftorah, which are just so beautiful, right? I will heal their affliction, generously loving them back in love, ki shava pi mimenu, because my anger will have turned back again. And then you have this again, I will appear like katal liYisrael. I will be experienced as Jew that allows Israel to blossom. Katal Yisrael Yifrach. That's chapter 14, verse 6. Keshoshana vayach shareshav kalavanon. And that's this. God is so. What I want to present to you, Yosef, is that God is basically saying in the course of this Haftorah, in the course of just two and a bit prakim, I'm going to appear to you at different times in history in very different ways, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'm going to appear to you like a lion or a bear, a wild, bereaved bear, and there are other times where I'm going to appear to you like life-giving dew that allows you to flourish in ways you didn't realize you could. And the question is, okay, I'm now a theologian thousands of years later, believing in this prophet Hoshea. Do I believe that God is like a spurned lover who would abuse his unfaithful wife, but who can be, really affectionate and kind when he's in other moods? Is he an unstable lover? What am I to do with this? And in order to answer that, I want to share with you two very disparate thinkers who say a very similar thing. Saadia Gaon, on the one hand, the 10th century great Jewish philosopher theologian, and C.S. Lewis, on the other hand, 20th century Christian theologian, the author of the Narnia series, most famously. So, in Emunot V'Dayot, Saadia Gaon's great philosophical work, he describes heaven, and he describes it as a sunny day, beautiful sunny day. And he says that all of those souls, that Jewish and non-Jewish, by the way, all of those souls who prepared themselves in the right way during their lifetime will experience that sunlight as the most uplifting, vivifying, edifying experience. And those souls who didn't prepare themselves in the right way will feel it like a burning fire. Mm-hmm. And you say, well, so, it's the same sunlight. It's not that God is being nice to these guys and vindictive to those guys. One and the same God in one and the same action, just the action of, I suppose, illuminating, burns up those who didn't prepare themselves properly for the experience and lifts up those who did prepare themselves appropriately for the experience. In a very similar light, C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, he describes God as the source of goodness and therefore the source of the ethical expectations that we can rightfully place upon ourselves, right? I should be a good person. You should be a good person. God is the source of those expectations. And he says, this is a direct quote from Mere Christianity. He says, you may want him to make an exception in your own case, to let you off this one time. But you know at bottom that unless the power behind the world really and unalterably detests that sort of behavior, then he cannot be good, right? If God really is the source of goodness, he doesn't make little exceptions. He always expects the best. On the other hand, says C.S. Lewis, we know that if there does exist an absolute goodness, it must hate much of what we do. And this is the terrible fix we are in. If the universe is not governed by an absolute goodness, then all our efforts are, in the long run, hopeless. But if it is, then we are making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day and are not in the least likely to do any better tomorrow. And so our case can seem hopeless. And just to conclude the piece, he said, on the one hand, God is the only comfort. On the other hand, he says, he's also the supreme terror, the thing we most need, and at one and the same time, the thing we most want to hide from. So that's the quote. So when I turn to these psukim in Hoshea, I find that a really useful perspective. I want to say, no, God isn't being vindictive. It's just that's how it can feel like to us, because we haven't fixed ourselves properly. But when we do fix ourselves properly, that very being who felt like a lion or a bear attacking us will be felt like a vivifying Jew.
I think that in the world we live in today, I'm thinking a little bit about like kind of how these ideas develop, right? In a world that's closer to the pagan world, the idea that you have a God who's just like angry and vengeful and will kind of come out with his machete and kill people, that wasn't such a crazy thought. Like I would almost imagine that the earliest, audiences of Hoshea would hear this and be like, yeah, sure. Meaning they were still also very deeply engaged in the world of polytheism, and they were in that surrounding. So it didn't sound to them so crazy. But we're looking at this, right, thousands of years later, in a world where we have absorbed and developed into very different directions of how we perceive of God. You mentioned earlier, we have the Middle Ages where we sort of say, no, God is totally transmutable, and then to even talk about emotions seems so far-fetched. And then we're sort of coming back, I think, to like a healthier middle space in these two ideas that you're bringing here. Again, one obviously from 1,000 years ago, and one that's more modern. But the idea that about this idea of perspective, and what's interesting about that is that it definitely in a world where like there's therapy and where we see people, the idea that different people can experience the same thing in different ways, which is clearly always been true, but we didn't have exposure to how people experience things. We met our immediate neighbors, right? Or we had our immediate clan, but we didn't know so much. And also people didn't always ask each other, right? I mean, again, I'm sure in side conversation, I'm talking about like as a culture, like in terms of the ideas that we perceive as holy. And in the culture we live in now, and I think it supports this reading of Hoshea, we live in a culture that really sees as holy this idea that different people experience the world differently, and that one person's perception of an amazing moment of their life for somebody else is a horrific moment for them.
There's a thought in Chazal that there were many more prophets in the history of Am Yisrael than receive a book. Right. Yeah. So who gets the books? And the thought is the books are canonized in virtue of a thought on the part of Chazal that the prophets who were canonized were those who had a message that speaks not just to their time, but to all times. And I suppose what you're helping us to see in what you just said, Yosef, is that there are dimensions here of this text that have always been there, but perhaps wouldn't have been so salient to the original audience. The original audience would probably take it quite literally. Oh, God's a bit like those pagan gods. So, one day he's angry, another day you can appease him, the next day you can... That's not a theology that speaks to us today. No. We can read the same verses, and I think without eisegesis, we can really see it in the Parshat wording, right? Ve'ehi ke, right? Kamo, I will be like. Ve'ehi lahem, I shall be to them like. Because I said, there's a different way of reading this that's much more consonant with modern sensibilities in two ways. The first way is the way you mentioned, which is just that, it's sensitive to the thought that different people can experience the same thing in different ways, depending on their circumstance. But it's also consonant with a theology in which actually, like Sajid Gaon said, God is constantly loving his creation. He's a constant lover. He's like Yaakov. He's a constant lover. But because of our inconstancy, we're going to experience that love in very different ways from one moment to another.
Yeah, I think that second piece is really important because what I brought up before was about the human perspective, that it meets us in different places. But I think the important theological point that you're trying to say, and I think that the piece from C.S. Lewis also brought out, is that there is a divine intention here. And the intention is the good intention. But where that meets people is something different. And those are really important pieces because in our modern times, we get caught up in our own personal perspective and we lose sense of like, is there a general intention? Is there even questions you can use the word hashgacha? Right. But the theology there, and I think that also you're supporting here, is this idea that God is putting good out into the world. Where that meets us is where God and human intentions meet each other, right? Did I get that?
Absolutely. And that's right. So if we haven't become, both as individuals and as a society, and perhaps as a global community, if we haven't created the right sorts of vessels with which to receive God's goodness and love, that very love can feel like a burning fire or a destructive force, God forbid.
So Sam, we have to wind down soon, but as we do that, I just want us to look briefly at really chapter 14, Perek Daled of Sefer Hoshea, which again is read in the Ashkenazi readings. This is the part of Hoshea that gets quoted. It's also sort of a paraphrasing of a famous passage from Sefer Dvarim, and it opens up Shuva Yisrael Adonai Adonai Elohecha, ki kashalta ba'avonecha, right? A call that we should do tshuva, right? That we should lashuv el Hashem because we have failed in our iniquities. K'chu imachem dvarim v'shuvu el Adonai, right? You should take these words, meaning I think take them to our heart and use them to encourage us to do tshuva. And I want maybe we could just reflect a little bit on the way that this ends, because at the end of Hoshea, we do feel that love again, right? There's definitely some sort of envelope structure happening here with the beginning of the book, albeit with quite a repetition of the phrase of our iniquities. He's never embarrassed to talk about our iniquities. So I'm just curious what you make of the last section.
Yeah, so it really ends on a very beautiful and poetic note, that the whole sefer, and like you say, of reconciliation. I particularly two things I think of particular note as far as Chazal are concerned of chapter 14. First is verse 3. It says "K'chu imachem dvarim," which they take to mean, and it's often translated this way, take words with you, v'shuva el Hashem, and return to God. Return to God just through the spoken word, because the temple's been destroyed. When Chazal, because the first temple was still standing in the times of Hoshea, but Chazal are reading these verses after the destruction of the second temple. It says, wow, you can take words alone, and return to Hashem, imrei lav, speak to him, and say, kol tisa avon v'kach tov, right? Forgive all my guilt, accept that which is good, unshalma farim safatenu, and I'm going to pay my debt to you, God, which I should pay with actual cows, but the cows of my lips, which is this strange phrase, but meaning I'm going to sacrifice through prayer. And this becomes a very key text for rabbinic thoughts about atonement in lieu of a temple. The temple can be destroyed and you can still return to God. Hoshea says so, right? No less.
For Hoshea, it was probably also likely his words, meaning take the words I've been saying to you and use them to do tshuva. And there are those that like to reinterpret it and also say that this was part of like the prophets who don't love sacrifice kind of idea.
And Reish Lakish uses a verse from this week's Haftorah and from the conclusion of the Haftorah. It's the same thought is there in Pasuk Bet as it is in Pasuk Yud. But in Pasuk Bet, which is what Reish Lakish quotes, it says, Shuv Yisrael ad Hashem, return to God, Hashem Elokecha, ki chashalta ba'avonotecha. And which translated here, I think it's the JPS of 2023, it says, for you have fallen because of your sin. Right, which is a fair translation. Reish Lakish reads it as, when you were sinning, it was actually a mistake. Right? Well, what do you mean it was actually a mistake? Well, the one way of explaining what Reish Lakish is trying to say is he's trying to say that what teshuvah does is it transforms past iniquities and somehow sheds a new light on them, perhaps making them less egregious than they would have been or they were before you repented. And so he has this allegorical reading, which is, Keshalta ba'avonotecha, after you've returned, your sins will look like they were mere stumblings, right? You stumbled in your sin. Of course, before you repented, we don't relate to your sins as if they were mere stumblings. They were provocations, they were crimes. But post repentance, God can say, Ki chashalta ba'avonotecha. Chapter 14 on its own is already a beautiful piece of kind of biblical love poetry between God and his penitent people about reconciliation, and it's really uplifting and has a sweetness to it. But the rabbis take it even further, I suppose, and they see within this last chapter the potential for reconciliation between humanity and God without the temple, without sacrifices, but just heart to heart. And they see a meditation upon the real power that repentance has, such that however however estranged God and the Jewish people might have felt, in those times when we experienced him like a wild bear, when we reconciled and look back at those times, they won't have as dark a kind of hue in our memory when we look back on them, because the repentance will be so great as to have even transformed past iniquities. So the rabbis take the beauty and take it perhaps even further.
Yeah, and I think also, if I can go back to the piece you mentioned before, or that we sort of explored together about this idea of perspective, the drasha of Chazal here of Reish Lakish is putting the onus of the shifting of perspective on the person, meaning the tshuva process, the point of it is so that we change where our center is. And if we change where our center is, then we're going to experience life differently. We're going to experience God differently. We're going to experience the things that we live through differently. And I think that drasha really brings us back to that theology.
A different perspective, but a complementary perspective, is when we change our own perspective on the relationship we have with God, so to speak, God also starts to see us in a new light. What we've been talking about all the way through this discussion is how we experience God differently in different times. But maybe there's a suggestion through Reish Lakish's reading. God experiences us differently at different times. The very fact that we do teshuvah and renounce the things that we did in the past and disavow ourselves of them, and we do that thoroughly and properly, and we try to make amends with anyone we may have hurt, etc., then God will no longer see us as sinners. He'll see us as people who once stumbled.
Yeah. I just want to add a little cherry to that, which is that's something I often talk about. And I'm going to use it in the metaphor sense, because obviously we're speaking about actually the immanent sense of God. But even if you take all these as metaphors, right? And you say, no, God is sort of the transcendent Middle Ages God that many of us have been taught. But you look at all these ideas in Tanakh as metaphors. I often speak with students about the importance of considering what metaphors are we living with, because if we consider, God to be, the old man or whatever vision we have versus we experience God as a lover, and obviously these things shift over different time periods, that these really shift the tenor of the relationship, and it shifts how we respond to different moments, right? Meaning whether it's in a moment of crisis or it's in a moment of gratitude, or these shifts in perspective of. Because you're saying something even bigger, which is that God could see us differently, right? Which we often don't think about very much, because who takes the perspective of God except when you're learning the prophets, right? So Hoshea does. But this idea that sometimes it's worth thinking about, what is a metaphor that's guiding me in my relationship with God? And sometimes it's a helpful one, or it's helpful for growth, and sometimes it really shuts down that option for growth. And I think that's something that's I think about it always very much during the Amim Noraim season, because we constantly sing out loud the different metaphors we have for God. But I think that it's something that this prophecy, Mecha, Roecha, Karmecha, we think all these different ideas. And I think though that this Hoshea in particular really reminds us of the importance of that. I really wanted to thank you for this conversation. And I want to also just say to all of our amazing listening community that I know that this is a different kind of conversation. Meaning here today, we took Hoshea, which is it's not a narrative piece, which is going to be true of quite a number of the prophetic portions that are chosen, that it's a piece that I think really is worth thinking about theologically. And, these ideas, I'm sure, landed differently for different people. But I really encourage all our listeners to go home, think about these ideas, speak about them within your family. These are things that really sit at the root of a lot of how we function in our I would say ruchani lives, right? In our spiritual relationship with God. They're not theoretical at all. They're very imminent in the way that we experience the world. And I think that whenever we again learn these Haftorah, that it reminds us of these ideas and their importance in our lives. So thanks for joining me today, Sam.
Thank you, Yosef. I just want to sign off on that and say that sometimes I think we are reticent about sharing the darker sides of our religious experience? What if we're angry with God? What if we experience God? We're religious. This is a religious experience, but you experience God as an antagonist. Are we comfortable speaking in those ways, right? Does God ever strike us like a wild animal who's attacking us? Obviously, I don't think that's a healthy place for our religiosity to be, but I also don't think we should shy away from discussing, when it feels that way.
Yeah, totally. And I think this week is a good opportunity. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.